There's a version of panic that shows up out of nowhere. Mid-drive, mid-dishes, halfway through folding laundry, right in the middle of an ordinary moment that has nothing to do with money at all. When your brain decides, without warning, to ask you one specific question. If something happened to me, would my kids actually be okay? Not okay in some vague, hopeful way. Okay in the real sense. Who has the paperwork? Who gets the phone call? Who knows where anything is? I've sat with that exact question more than once, heart going, and the worst part wasn't the fear itself. It was realizing I genuinely didn't know the answer. If you've ever felt that exact wave of panic, if you've ever felt frustrated as a parent, wondering if you're the only one who hasn't figured this out, if you've ever felt that specific gut-level fear of not knowing what would actually happen to your kids, this video is for you, and I want to tell you honestly what you're going to walk away with if you stay for the next 20 minutes. By the end of this, you're going to have the actual list, the real one, not the vague internet version, of every piece of a family's financial plan that most parents quietly avoid, in the order that actually matters, with the specific first step for each one. Not someday. This week, if you want it. I'm Alora, and this is the Finance Mom HQ, where we talk about the money stuff nobody ever actually sits parents down to explain. And I want to say clearly, right at the start, that today isn't just for moms. This one's for every parent listening, because that exact feeling doesn't care which parent is the one carrying it or what time of day it happens to show up. This channel has become something like a lifeline for a lot of the parents who watch it. People who tell me over and over that nobody ever sat them down either, that they've been quietly winging this their entire parenting life and just assumed everyone else had it more figured out than they did. If that's you, I need you to hear this clearly before we go any further. Almost nobody has this figured out. I didn't, for years. The list I'm about to walk you through is the one I wish someone had handed me the week we brought our first baby home, instead of the one I had to assemble myself, piece by piece, usually after a scare reminded me I'd been putting it off. Before we get into the list itself, I want to name the thing that makes this whole topic feel so much harder than it actually is. Financial planning for parents doesn't feel like a task. It feels like a confrontation with the exact thing you least want to think about. Your own mortality, your own fragility, the possibility of your kids needing you, and you not being there. That emotional weight is precisely why so many of us avoid this stuff for years. Not because the actual steps are complicated, but because just opening the folder feels like inviting in a fear we'd rather keep the lid on. Here's what actually helped me get past that. None of this is about predicting disaster. It's about building a version of your family's life that holds up no matter what happens. The ordinary version, where you live to be 90 and none of this ever gets used, and the version where something happens far too soon. A real plan protects both futures at once, and once it exists, you genuinely stop thinking about the scary version nearly as often, because the fear had nowhere left to attach itself. The first piece, and honestly the one most parents avoid the longest, is term life insurance. Real coverage sized to actually replace your income for as long as your kids need it replaced. Not the small policy tucked inside a work benefits package that quietly stops the day you leave that job. Here's the misconception that keeps so many of us underinsured. We think about life insurance in terms of funeral costs and funeral costs alone, which is why so many people either skip it entirely or buy a policy so small it wouldn't actually change anything for their family. The real question isn't what a funeral costs. It's what your income is worth over the years your kids still need it. The mortgage, the childcare, the ordinary weekly grocery run, all of it, for as many years as it would take your family to get back on stable footing without you. A rough, honest way to think about the number is somewhere around 10 times your annual income, sometimes more if your kids are young enough that they'd need support for 15 or 20 more years. Term life insurance for a healthy parent in their 30s, for a policy that size, often costs less per month than a single streaming subscription. I was genuinely shocked the first time I got a real quote because I'd spent years assuming it would be far more than it actually was. I put off getting our policy for almost 2 years after our first was born, not because we couldn't afford it, but because filling out the application meant answering questions about my own health and mortality that I just didn't want to sit with. The week I finally did it, it took maybe 25 minutes online, and afterward, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not dread, but relief. The specific relief of finally closing a loop I'd been avoiding. This week, if you don't already have real-term life coverage, get one actual quote. Just one. You don't have to buy anything yet, you just have to see the real number instead of the imagined one. Because for most healthy parents, the real number is a lot less frightening than the 2 years of avoiding it ever was. The second piece is a legal guardianship designation. The actual, written, legally recognized answer to who raises your children if both parents are gone, decided by you in advance instead of left for a court or a disagreement between well-meaning relatives to sort out later. This is the one that stops more parents cold than almost anything else on this list, because choosing feels impossible. Nobody feels fully ready to name the person who'd raise their children. But here's the reframe that helped me get past it. You're not choosing the only acceptable option in the universe. You're choosing the best available option on a day when you're calm and thinking clearly, instead of leaving that same impossible choice to a judge who's never met your kids during what would already be the worst week of everyone's life. Without this designation in writing, the decision doesn't just disappear. It goes to a court, guided by whatever your state's default rules happen to be, which may not match what either parent would have actually wanted. Extended family members can end up in disputes over kids at the exact moment those kids most need stability, not conflict. We put off naming a guardian for almost 3 years, mostly because David and I kept circling the same 2 families and couldn't fully agree. What finally broke the stalemate was realizing that revisiting the choice later is always allowed. Nothing about this decision is permanent. We picked the family that felt right for right now, wrote it into an actual legal document with a lawyer, and gave ourselves permission to update it in 5 years if our life or theirs had changed by then. This week, have the actual conversation, even if it's uncomfortable, even if you don't reach a final answer tonight. An imperfect decision, made and written down, protects your kids more than a perfect decision you're still circling 3 years from now. The third piece is a family-sized emergency fund. Not the generic 3 to 6 months advice you've heard 100 times, but a number actually calculated against what your specific family would need if income stopped tomorrow, kids and all. The mistake most parents make here is treating the emergency fund conversation as one they already had before kids arrived, without ever going back and resizing it. A childless emergency fund and a family emergency fund are not the same number. Childcare doesn't pause during a job loss. A kid's medical need doesn't wait for a more convenient month. The honest number for most families with young kids sits closer to 6 months of full family expenses, not 6 months of a leaner, kid-free version of your life from years ago. A neighbor of mine went through a layoff 8 months after her second child was born, and she told me the single thing that kept that period from becoming a genuine crisis was that she and her husband had recalculated their emergency fund target the year before, specifically to reflect the cost of 2 kids in daycare, not the pre-kids number they'd been sitting on since before either child existed. The job search took longer than either of them expected. The fund, sized correctly, was the only reason it never became a 5-alarm situation on top of everything else. This week, if your emergency fund number predates your kids, recalculate it. Add up a real month of expenses as your family actually lives now, childcare included, every recurring cost included, and compare that honest number to whatever's actually sitting in the account. If any of this is landing so far, I want to tell you quickly why this channel even exists. I started it because I wanted to reach as many parents as I possibly could. The ones nobody ever sat down and actually walked through this stuff, the way nobody walked me through it either. Every person who subscribes brings me one parent closer to that. So if this is useful, hit subscribe, because we've still got 7 more pieces of this plan to go, and a few of them are the ones almost nobody talks about at all. The fourth piece is disability insurance. Protection for your income while you're still alive and still needing it, which statistically matters more during your working years than the life insurance most people prioritize instead. Here's the number that changed how I thought about this. A working parent in their 30s is genuinely more likely to experience a disability that interrupts their income for an extended stretch than to die during those same working years. And yet, almost nobody plans for that version of the crisis because it's less dramatic to imagine than the worst-case scenario, even though it's the more statistically likely one. Many employers offer a baseline short-term disability benefit, but it often replaces only a portion of your income and only for a limited window, enough to cover a brief medical leave, not enough to carry a family through a longer recovery. A separate long-term disability policy fills that gap, and for many people, it costs far less than they assume, especially if purchased while you're still healthy. A former coworker of mine was out of work for nearly a year after a car accident that had nothing to do with anything she could have prevented, And she told me the long-term disability policy she'd set up almost as an afterthought years earlier was the single financial decision that kept her family's plans, the mortgage, the kids' routines, all of it, completely intact during a year that could have unraveled everything else. This week, find out what disability coverage you actually have through work, if any, and what its real limits are. Most people have never actually read that specific piece of their benefits packet, and it's worth 20 minutes to know exactly what it does and doesn't cover. The fifth piece is updating your beneficiary designations, the specific names listed on your retirement accounts, your life insurance policy, and anything else with a named beneficiary, which override your will entirely, regardless of what your will actually says. This is the piece almost nobody realizes matters as much as it does. A beneficiary designation is a contract, separate from your will, and if it's outdated, it wins, legally, automatically, no matter what other document says otherwise. People who forget to update these after having kids can accidentally leave a retirement account to an ex-spouse, a childhood account still listing a parent, or nobody specific at all, years after their actual wishes changed completely. I found out about this the uncomfortable way, when I finally sat down to review our accounts and discovered that one of my retirement accounts, opened years before I met David, still listed my own mother as the sole beneficiary. Not incorrect exactly, but nowhere close to what I'd actually have wanted once we had kids of our own. It took about 15 minutes to update once I actually logged in and looked. This week, log into every account you have with the beneficiary field, every retirement account, every life insurance policy, and just check who's currently listed. It takes minutes, and it's the single most overlooked step on this entire list. The sixth piece is a will, the actual legal document, not just the guardianship designation we already talked about, but the broader document that spells out how everything else you own gets distributed and handled. The misconception here is thinking a will is only for people with significant wealth to distribute. It isn't. A will is what keeps every other decision on this list, the guardian you chose, the way you want assets handled for minor children, who manages money on your kids' behalf until they're old enough, from being decided by a default state formula instead of your own actual wishes. Without one, state law decides everything, often in ways that surprise people. Assets can end up tied up longer than necessary. A surviving parent may have less control than they'd assume over money technically meant for their own kids. None of that is guaranteed to go badly, but none of it is guaranteed to go the way you'd have wanted either. And a will is the document that removes the guesswork entirely. We used an online service for ours, rather than a full attorney consultation, mostly because our situation was fairly straightforward, and it took under an hour to complete once we actually sat down and did it. The hardest part, by far, was making the time to start. The document itself was the easy part once we stopped avoiding it. This week, if you don't have a will, at minimum, research what your options actually are. A simple online service versus a lawyer, so that when you're ready to act, you're not starting from zero on a topic you've never looked into at all. The seventh piece is a plan for education costs, not necessarily a full college fund, but an actual, deliberate decision about how much you intend to contribute, if any, instead of a vague hope that gets revisited every year without ever actually being decided. Here's what surprised me most researching this one. The families who feel calmest about education costs aren't necessarily the ones who've saved the most. They're the ones who made an actual decision early, a specific monthly contribution, or a specific decision not to prioritize this over other goals, instead of carrying a permanent, undefined guilt about a number they'd never actually calculated or committed to either way. A 529 education savings account is the most common tool for this, offering tax advantages specifically for education expenses. But the tool matters less than the decision behind it. Even a modest, consistent monthly contribution, started early, benefits enormously from years of compounding before that money is ever needed. My cousin and her husband decided early on to contribute a specific, modest amount every month, rather than trying to fund an entire future tuition bill outright, and she told me the actual relief came less from the account balance itself and more from simply having made the decision at all, instead of carrying an open, undefined question about it for 18 years. This week, decide, even if the decision is a firm, considered no for now. An intentional no, revisited later if your situation changes, is a completely different thing than an undefined maybe you never actually examine. The eighth piece is teaching your own kids real financial literacy, starting far earlier than most of us assume makes sense. Because the habits and beliefs they form about money start forming long before any of us think to have the actual conversation. The mistake most of us make is waiting for some vague future moment when our kids seem old enough for a real conversation about money. And that moment somehow never quite arrives, so the conversation just never happens at all. Kids as young as 4 or 5 can understand simple, concrete ideas that money is limited, that choices involve trade-offs, that saving means waiting for something rather than getting it right away. A simple practice that several parents I know use is giving young kids a small, regular amount and letting them make their own small choices with it, including choices you might not have made yourself. Because the lesson lives in the experience of a real, if small, trade-off, not in a lecture about one. I started this with Ethan far earlier than I expected to, mostly by accident, after he asked why we couldn't buy something at the store, and I found myself giving him an honest, simple answer instead of a deflection. That one small, honest conversation turned into an ongoing one, and I've noticed he now asks better questions about money at 4 than I was asking well into my 20s. This week, look for one small, honest moment with your own kids to talk about a real money decision you're making, in language they can actually follow. You don't need a formal lesson, you just need one honest moment to start. The 9th piece is protecting your own retirement while you're also supporting your kids, because it's genuinely possible to be so focused on your children's future that you quietly underfund your own, and that particular mistake tends to become a burden on your kids eventually anyway. Here's the uncomfortable math behind this one. Your kids have decades of earning potential, financial aid options, and scholarships available to fund their own education if needed. You do not have equivalent options available to fund your own retirement later in life. Every dollar diverted from your own retirement toward your kids' future past a certain point can end up costing your kids more later in the form of needing to support you than it ever saved them earlier. This isn't a case for ignoring your kids' needs. It's a case for sequencing correctly. Retirement contributions, at least enough to capture any employer match available to you, generally need to come before extra contributions toward other family goals, precisely because retirement is the one goal on this entire list with no other funding source available later. I had to have an honest conversation with myself about this a couple of years ago when I realized I'd been quietly reducing my own retirement contributions to free up more for the kids' accounts without ever consciously deciding that was the right trade-off. Once I actually ran the numbers side by side, the sequencing became obvious in a way it hadn't been when I was making the decision on autopilot. This week, check what your own retirement contributions actually look like right now, and compare that honestly against whatever you're setting aside for your kids. If retirement has been quietly losing that competition without you ever deciding it should, this is the week to notice. The 10th and final piece is simply building one recurring habit of actually reviewing this entire plan together as a family on a real schedule, instead of assembling all 9 pieces once and then never looking at any of it again for the next decade. A financial plan built once and never revisited slowly drifts out of date in exactly the ways that matter most. The beneficiary that's now wrong, the coverage amount that no longer matches your actual income, the guardian conversation that hasn't kept pace with how your extended family has changed. None of these pieces are meant to be permanent decisions made once. They're meant to be living decisions, checked periodically against your actual current life. Several of the parents on my radar over the years have mentioned some version of an annual review, often timed around a birthday, an anniversary, the start of a new year, whatever naturally recurs, where they sit down together and simply walk back through this exact list, updating whatever's changed. It's rarely more than an hour, once a year, and it's the single habit that keeps everything else on this list from quietly going stale. David and I do ours every January now, going through this same list piece by piece. And I'll admit the first year felt tedious. By the 3rd year, it had become something closer to a ritual, an hour where we simply make sure our real life still matches what's written down, instead of assuming it does. This week, or really this month, put an actual date on the calendar for your own first review, even if most of these pieces aren't finished yet. The date matters more than the readiness. It's what turns this into a habit instead of a one-time scramble. 10 pieces, and I know that's a lot to hold at once, especially if you're hearing several of these for the first time today. You don't need all 10 finished by next week. Almost no parent I've ever talked to built all of this at once. It's closer to picking whichever piece scares you the most, starting there, and letting the relief of finishing that one piece carry you into the next. So here they are again, laid out plainly. Real term life insurance sized to your actual income. A written guardianship decision instead of an unspoken hope. An emergency fund resized for your family as it actually exists today. Disability coverage checked and understood. Beneficiary designations actually verified. A real will. A decision, one way or the other, about education costs. Early, honest conversations with your own kids about money. Your own retirement protected instead of quietly deprioritized. And one recurring family habit of reviewing all of it together. None of these 10 things require you to have this all figured out already. They just require you to stop avoiding that question whenever it happens to show up for you and actually answer it, one piece at a time, while you're calm enough to do it well. I still feel that specific wave sometimes, running through everything I didn't yet know the answer to. I don't feel that same panic anymore, not because I've become someone who never worries, but because I finally know exactly where every answer lives. And so does David. And so, when they're old enough, will our kids. So tell me, out of these 10, which one do you already have handled, and which one is the one you've been quietly avoiding? Drop it in the comments, because I genuinely want to know which of these turns out to be the hardest one for people to actually start. I'm Alora. This is the Finance Mom HQ. Raising kids and retirement funds. Go take care of both, and I'll see you in the next one.